du meine Arbeit für richtig hältst, ob du glaubst, dass ich fleißig gewesen bin, dass ich gearbeitet habe, dass ich mich in diesen Jahren für dich eingesetzt habe, dass ich anständig meine Zeit verwendet habe im Dienste meines Volkes. Gib du jetzt deine Stimme ab. Wenn ja, dann tritt für mich ein, so wie ich für dich eingetreten bin.
Well, good morning and welcome back to the Rhine Report. This is Stuart Rhine, and today's discussion is the Federalist Governor's War against fascism in America, the fight against dictatorship, what governors can possibly do to fight back against the use of military, which is against the law and is unconstitutional. The question arises about how the states and D.C., being a federal district, if at all possible, can counteract the Trumpian assault on democracy and the Constitution by deploying troops in blue cities within blue states, setting the military against our own civilian population.
To act like Donald Trump
we're
is
also hearing
Mad
on
King
a more
Donald
serious
the
note of
First.
what these guardsmen will be doing, that they are going to now be carrying rifles and pistols. Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, has said that these weapons are for self-defense use only, not for law enforcement.
Self-defense from what? Gelato? Double espressos? Look, Washington, D.C. is a tourist mecca. Tourist mecca. If they're going to be out patrolling with Metropolitan Police officers or with now the entirety of the FBI, this is the equivalent of Britain emptying MI5 and making them beat cops with New Scotland Yard. They're now on the streets. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearm, Park effing Rangers are now on the street. This is the single stupidest thing that I've seen in American history, and I am a student of American history. But for a guardsman to go on the street, they're not walking out there with M17, M18 pistols. They are patrolling with M4 long rifles.
And those who believe his reasons are primarily performative are both extremely naive and seriously out of touch with reality.
So I want to ask you about what is happening with Donald Trump and American cities. And I want to broaden this from the discussion that I see in so many places, which is really about Washington, D.C. And don't get me wrong, you work in Washington, D.C., I work in Washington, D.C., both of us live around Washington, D.C. So what is happening there is an absolute travesty in my estimation, in my opinion. But I think it is wrong for people to think that Donald Trump only wants to deploy the National Guard and the military in Washington, D.C. And we know this because actually the first city he sent in the National Guard, the first city in which he sent in the Marines was actually Los Angeles. And, you know, we're seeing him have a back and forth now with Chicago. He has mentioned New York. And, you know, I don't think that this ends with just Washington, D.C., or even those cities. I think this is part of an effort by Donald Trump to put U.S. military, National Guard in blue cities. And we can talk about why that is. I think it relates in part to the 2026 elections. But talk to us a little bit, both as a member of Congress, as a student of American history and constitutional law, and also of politics. What do you make of this effort by him? What is he trying to achieve? What ground does he stand on? And do you agree with me that you think this spreads much, much further?
Well, I do want to come back at the end, Mark, to where you began, which is the elections next year, because I think ultimately this is his objective and his destination, which is to create a series of crises and pretexts for intervention.
And by the way, my nominee for Moron of the Month is mealy-mouthed Mayor Muriel Browser of Washington, who is supplicating at the feet of one Nazi, Donald J. Trump, with her comments as of today. It's Wednesday as I create this video. You just have to read the comments. Crime is down thanks to these federal troops. I welcome them. Oh, but there might be a break in trust with the community. What kind of bullshit is that? She's a moron. Anyway, let's assess the whole situation as it is, first of all. Trump's utilization of basically a subset federal statute and another, too, are being tested in the courts as we speak, both in California and Washington, D.C., under different applications, as D.C. falls under home rule and a 740 exception, while California is being tested by USC 12406. Now, it's notable that Trump has not yet invoked the Insurrection Act, which is the only real means for him to overcome the prohibitions of the Posse Comitatus Act that prevents the military being used against civilians in our cities and states. Please note that this act has been sparingly used, considering historical precedents, with a mixed success rate, but does give him the best chance of being permitted to deploy troops into our civilian population, and that success or failure revolves around the legal fiction created by the implications of a legal concept, a bogus one, by the way, referred to as judicial deference, which I've covered in another podcast, where the courts defer to the judgment of a party or agency or branch of government in considering a decision in any given case. And this goes back to 1935 and a case called Humphrey's Executor. Deference here, within this frame of reference, relates to a mad king's cries of national emergency. However bizarre, conclusory, and false, outside the bounds of believable a priori knowledge, but relied on as a justification for federalization of the National Guard and militarization. So you good folks might ask, what then is the purpose of placing the military into our streets, if it is not merely a performative show of Trump's power? And my answer is that militarization represents a backup plan for the present fascist takeover of our democracy.
And M16s. That's what they're patrolling with. No one is having, look, the North Hollywood shootout isn't going to break out in front of the Smithsonian to where they need anti-body armor weapons. The threat here is the White House. And as a scholar of counterterrorism who has written multiple books, including New York Times bestsellers on terrorism, there is a phrase for this: state-sponsored terrorism. When the machination, the machinery of the government is turned inward to suppress its own people. That's what these idiot guardsmen are doing out there. And I'm going to D.C. to go walk around and read them the Riot Act, because these young troops, they don't know, they're following orders. But they could get in 2021, 2020. When they were ordered in Washington, D.C., Donald Trump ordered his Secretary of Defense to shoot civilian protesters in front of the Capitol, in front of Lafayette Square, right?
Where other means of maintaining power and control are either threatened or challenged with some degree of success. That is my hypothesis, and I believe it to be the right one given all of the evidence to date in both actions and rhetoric flooding the zone. So, what if the elections of 2026 are won by Democrats, and that impedes the implementation of a dictatorship to some extent as the Congress gets reformed? What if his Nazi majority Supreme Court turn against him? A big what if. Trump's last recourse and resort will be to call in the Army, Navy, Air Force, National Guards of the redneck states to keep him in power in what will be a full-fledged civil war and putsch. Sounds bad. Well, yes, it is. Just remember, we are dealing with a sociopathic, functional psychotic with a demonic narcissistic personality disorder, a convicted felon, and sexual predator without the glimmer of a conscience or any moral code, lacking in any of the normal human traits. Okay, you say, well, what can we do right now aside from fighting in the courts?
And moving away from some of the more dramatic imagery we've seen of these soldiers in US cities, how do the National Guard usually operate? I mean, as most of our UK and European audiences won't know as much about the National Guard and its functions. We, a lot of people in Europe have seen before news stories about National Guard being deployed. A lot of people will think of the LA riots of the 1990s. Right. When is it right to deploy the National Guard, and when is it not?
Well, first off, the National Guard does not belong to the President of the United States. The National Guard is a militia force that was set up during the American Revolution, which was decided to be under the control of each of the colonies, then moved on to governors. The governor of each state controls the National Guard. Only in times of national emergency, right? For example, the LA riots, the National Guard was not called out by the president. It was called out by the governor of the state of California in order to assist the Los Angeles Police Department to gain control of the streets because there was rioting, right? We have a lot of rioting in the United States, just as you have soccer hooliganism. We have rioting when a Super Bowl is won. We have rioting when a baseball game is won. And they don't generally bring out the National Guard. Most city police forces are capable of stopping this. But in times of crisis or war, National Guard units are still part of the armed forces of the United States. They can be mobilized for combat deployments overseas. Otherwise, they are only mobilized for real humanitarian crises within our country. For example, the flooding that took place in North Carolina, the recent mass floods that took place in Texas that killed 135 civilians. The National Guard has the trucks, generators, meals ready to eat, the resources that will assist the Federal Emergency Management Agency, an agency Donald Trump just eliminated.
The answer lies predominantly in federalism, of all things. In the states, and with the individual governors, combined with whatever litigation might be necessary. Yes, governors, our friends, generally can refuse the federalization of their National Guard members as they maintain control and command under Title 32 status, which requires state consent for deployments. However, it's true, a president can overcome a governor's refusal by invoking the Insurrection Act. Remember how I said Trump has so far avoided using it, which allows the federal government to directly place National Guard members under federal command. In such cases, the president may bypass the governor and have the federalization order delivered directly to the state's adjutant general. Now, what comes under this Title 32 status? Well, governor's power to refuse National Guard members in Title 32 National Guard status are under the command and control of their respective governors. That's the first given. The federal government cannot deploy federal National Guard troops without the governor's consent. There was something called the Montgomery Amendment, which seems inappropriate for the purposes of our discussion. The Montgomery Amendment is a 1986 federal law that took away state governors' authority to block the overseas deployment of their state's National Guard units, specifically for training purposes, based on reasons like location or schedule. The amendment was enacted after several governors refused to send their National Guard to Central America, leading to a Supreme Court case in 1990, Perpich versus the Department of Defense, and that upheld Congress's power to authorize these deployments without gubernatorial consent. This is interesting, though, because the key part of the decision is that it is Congress that has the authority to restrain governors from blocking deployments, not the president. So it's in the hands of all governors not merely to refuse to accede to Trump's military deployments to their cities, challenging them after the fact in court. I am going to suggest further that they can call up their National Guards in advance of any such threat to protect these cities from any federal military invasion by any means necessary, including the erection of state barriers with patrols and resistance to incursions from unauthorized and unconstitutional federal or other state National Guards.
I'm sorry if this gets out of control. I'm gonna make a prediction, and I'm awesome at my predictions because I'm never wrong. You will have two things happen. One, you will have American citizens shot, whether by accident, accidental discharge. The M18, M17 pistol, which is the SIG P320, has been known now to accidentally discharge by not even handling it, but by bumping it. So we're going to get a troop who shoots himself, has a negligent discharge as he's trying to unload an M4 without a clearing barrel, or accidentally shoots a civilian because he's ready to do it and he thinks that there's a gun and he's not a cop and it's against the law. The other thing you're going to have is rebellion. You're going to have mutiny. You're going to have officers, senior enlisted who are going to go, hey, whoa, this is not us clearing out sandbags for a flood. This is unlawful, and I'm not going to take part in this. They will get court-martialed. And it's right. They should freaking ask for a court-martial, because then it'll have to come through a panel that has 250 years of not obeying political whims of people in government, only by the blood, toil, and loss of the Uniform Code of Military Justice.
So, does this sound draconian? Yes. Will it necessarily work? I don't know. But anything is worth trying to defy the fascist takeover of this country.
Why are we even talking about this? The very fact that there are officers who are not slamming down their freaking stars. People like me, senior enlisted, as I said, I was a senior chief petty officer in the Navy. You are looking at the trappings of my world. We have a phrase in the Navy when you hit a hard place and you're going to have to put your career on line. We call it dropping your anchors. People should be dropping their goddamn anchors over this and making it eminently clear they will not carry out orders like this. But we have a moron as the Secretary of Defense. We have an administration filled with people whose sole function is to exploit government for political gain or personal gain. And they've now neutered the senior leadership of the Pentagon. The first 3 people to be fired at the Pentagon were the black chief of the armed forces, the woman chief of the Navy, and then the judge advocate general, the top lawyer in the armed forces, because they made it clear the lawyers who were to advise of what is legal and not legal were being reduced to essentially running divorce seminars on Fridays and were not allowed to weigh in on what the armed forces could do that is legal and proper.
Happening right in front of our eyes. It's demonic. It's disgusting. Donald J. Trump is a fucking monster, and the people in back of him are just as fucking bad. And we either fight back or our democracy dies. Thank you.
It is against the law. That deployment was against the law. It violated the Posse Comitatus Act, which was built for that exact reason, so that the U.S. government could not occupy cities.